And welcome to Get the Table, another wrestling roundtable discussion podcast with myself, Adam Wilborn, and the Dudley Boys of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, here to discuss another burning wrestling issue. And that issue today is fantasy booking AEW's Perfect Collision debut episode. And the only real place to start here, Sidge, is CM Punk on it?
I don't know. I hope so. I'm torn. Every other day, I alternate between, is the man worth it or isn't he? When the discourse gets too much and you read the real stories or the fake stories, and who knows what stories are real or fake, you just get exhausted by it and you think, you know what, if you were in Tony Khan's position and you had a decision to make and it might actually reach this point where a decision has to be made, maybe I'd think, oh, it's not worth it. If he was 30. If he was 30 and he was this talented and this much of a genius and he did have this literal cult of personality, I'd probably go, you know what, yes, he is, but he isn't. And then I watch his work in AEW and I think, yeah, of course he is. The man is a professional wrestling genius. His work was unbelievable. And, so, look, if there has to be a collision, yes, I hope he's on it, of course. Yeah. And I think he has to be on it. No, it's a disaster in waiting if CM Punk isn't on this program. I'm not saying the program would instantly fail and be an irredeemable failure, but they can't launch it without him. It's particularly not in the United Center. They've already killed the idea of a second show not named Dynamite with their apathetic treatment of Rampage. So there's already a bit of suspicion and cynicism, at least from my perspective. Maybe somebody else's, I don't know. This cannot launch without CM Punk. Otherwise, it's just 2 more hours of a show that, for me at least, was valuable because it just felt so elusive. This premium, must-see, 2 hours every single week. A throwback in terms of, felt like anti-content, and now it feels like content. It will feel less like content if CM Punk is at the helm, but for my own very selfish reasons, yes, I want him to be on it.
We're less than a month away before we get the first episode of AEW Collision, and I think Sidge is right. CM Punk is an integral figure to it, not just in terms of being on the show, but that creative influence. And we should mention, at time of recording today, the news about Bryan Danielson being brought back onto AEW Creative for Collision.
Yeah, it's interesting that he wanted to get his feet wet and creative in WWE.
Yeah.
I think he was just asked,
Yeah. And he spoke, and I think, didn't he, about he liked it, and he sort of liked giving it a try. And there hasn't yet, I don't think, been any major storylines that can be tied to Bryan Danielson or Daniel Bryan in WWE that were a success, but this is a great opportunity to prove himself in this arena, and if it's something he wants to do and we can start looking at stories that he's helped craft, then suddenly they've landed on yet something else that Bryan Danielson can do, and it's brilliant to have him on your team. In terms of Punk, Sidge has nailed it. Launch is the word. I think I'm putting all my pro-Punk biases to one side. I think you might only get 6 months after launch. It's reasonable to assume that this return might only last as long as his comeback. It's CM Punk. He's this controversial figure. It's, for me, part of the appeal, but the reality is you might only get a year out of him, whether that's because of age, injuries, or backstage problems, or just the inability for everybody to work together forever, happily. It might be there for a good time rather than a long one. But launch is crucial because he serves as a disguise from this being content. Cynicism for AEW doing anything beyond Dynamite is earned at this point in reality. Dark and Dark Elevation always were purpose-serving, if not must-see, if not always spectacular and entertaining. They were purpose-serving, especially when the rankings were in place. But even just to give wrestlers opportunities, potentially get them jobs, there was a kind of nice and an earnest purpose to Dark and Dark Elevation. Rampage had that for 6 weeks, if that, and
longer.
But did it have it for longer? I can think of those early days of, again, that name, CM Punk being exclusive to it, a few big title matches here and there.
But the CM Punk Eddie Kingston promo battle happened.
Well, there was there was a few big special moments on Rampage when it was being taken seriously, but I just think, too much time has passed where it swung the other way, and we've seen AEW get consumed by the excesses of content through Rampage, and to a lesser extent through Tony Khan thinking that he should have Ring of Honor and have it as a pressing concern and run pay-per-views and book the shows. And I just think for now, Punk makes Collision feel different. He makes it feel like, not the reason for it to be, the reason for that is all that money. That's the reason for it to be. But from a creative standpoint, from a fan investment standpoint, he gives it the reason to be. It's not a hard sell without him, but it's really tricky to try and tell people it's different to Dynamite.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single wrestler on that roster that you could lift off Dynamite and say, you will never get them on Dynamite again. And I could well see them actually pitching that as a stipulation for a Chris Jericho, for example. But I don't think there's anyone else in that roster currently, pre-existing at least, that you could say, right, you're never going to get them on Dynamite again. That's going to make you go, well, best race to Collision then. I think Punk is uniquely placed there.
Yeah, Punk's the sort of guy you say, you get CM Punk and you get Andrade and Miro and Thunder Rosa and what have you. Just without that name, I don't know, like you say, if it's going to have that same impact.
No.
But in terms of launching shows, Dynamite and Rampage, brilliant both times. Obviously, like I say, Collision, June 17th is when it is going to launch, Sidge. What do they need to learn from what they did with Dynamite to make this show as consistent as we get from Wednesday nights from AEW?
I've got two takes on this, and they might contradict one another, but I hope I can articulate it properly, okay? I want this show to feel different from Dynamite. As much as I love AEW when it's at its peak, I really, really think it's a great product when they reach those highs. I don't need to see 2 more hours of it in a week. I don't. I'm old and I'm tired and I've got children. And I just like the idea of having this awesome thing that a lot of thought goes into, that has this anti-thumbnails everywhere feeling for me. You know what I mean? Like, I just want it to feel elusive and premium and a destination for our weekly viewing. It just feels old school. It just feels like something that's worth the wait and all the rest of it. So I don't need 2 more hours of Dynamite at all, especially when Dynamite this year and kind of last year as well is sort of eating itself in terms of its tropes and its cliches. I mean, Starks versus Jericho. Yes, the match was good at Revolution, but what a cliche. What a cliche of a build with a gauntlet, like Tony Khan is exhausting those ideas that first felt fresh. So I do think, in and of itself, and because Dynamite is starting to show its age, I do think Collision must feel different. Now, the perfect scenario is that Dynamite is helmed by the Elite. They can continue their incredible story, which has been renewed and rebooted or whatever, and they take this episodic mystery approach wherein, is Don Callis going to turn on Kenny Omega? What's the status between the Elite? Friends, foes, somewhere in between? What side is Takeshita on? With Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks and the Elite, they like to weave these sort of spiderweb narratives where there's loads of different things going on, Easter eggs, lots of different players. They love storylines that fold in a lot of different wrestlers. For me, and this works because you've got CM Punk for now, we think, at the helm of Collision, or at least greatly influencing the booking, I'd love to see an emphasis on one-on-one blood feuds, like less fussy, not saying like not as detailed, not just they talk trash to one another, then they have a beatdown, and then they have a fight. No one wants to watch 29 NXT. What I'm saying is that if they can aspire to Kenny Omega versus Hangman Page on Wednesdays and aspire to MJF versus CM Punk on Saturdays, that's what I want to see. That's the best possible outcome to having a split roster and 2 2-hour TV shows. Now, when you ask me the other bit of that question is what lessons can they learn from Dynamite, I think it is imperative that the first episode of Collision kind of borrows from Dynamite, and that's where I'm being a bit hypocritical. The first episode of Dynamite was phenomenal. Between the Cody versus Sammy Guevara match and the foreshadowing that Sammy Guevara and Chris Jericho might be in cahoots, but you would never have noticed that after just watching it for 20 minutes, and then the Inner Circle forms. What they did, and this is the most pretentious thing I might have ever said, think of the ground that covers, is that they sort of incited this narrative Big Bang, where in one angle, that was perfect, that created so much. One plot hole, it should have been a no DQ, but they formed the Inner Circle. They advanced Chris Jericho versus Cody Rhodes. They further built Jon Moxley versus Kenny Omega. They planted the seeds for the Blood and Guts match, even if it didn't end up happening because of the pandemic. It was like a narrative big bang, and it just kept me on the hook for, I'd like to see what happens with this, that, and that. And it gave me the trust, the all-important trust that, wow, if I keep watching this show, because I've been shown a thrilling glimpse of this main event picture, I know that the next 6 months, realistically, they've got a plan for it. And watching that plan unfold and the trust that what you are watching is actually purposeful was really pivotal to my like early AEW fandom. If they can do something that with Collision, I can't book it, Tony Khan should book it. And CM Punk should have influence over it because he's a diamond-sharp wrestling mind, then that is the way to do it.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. Dynamite proved itself a success story when in early 2020 it got that rights fee deal off the back of one of its weaker runs, truthfully. At the tail end of 2019, it still got the trust of the viewership. Tony Khan was able to get the trust of the network, and immediately, obviously, when he took control in early 2020, probably reassured people that now there's going to be a singular vision with a bit of guidance. So following that pattern makes business sense, but it also makes creative sense. I think AEW, this is a really strange time for AEW to be launching a new television show. If you look at their business currently, business has probably never been softer domestically, and yet 61 plus as of recording 1,000 tickets are sold in Wembley. They're just not selling arenas out in America, and yet we're talking about a TV show that's generating billions of dollars that might debut at the United Center. So it's such a study in contrasts at the moment, AEW. You can take some of that conversation away by reassuring people from the off that Collision is going to be the AEW you want, not more of the one you don't. And I just think that following that model, again, it places trust in some of the creative people. So if it is Bryan or if it is Punk with Tony Khan, it kind of places trust in that system. It stands to get a lot of wrestlers, like we'll talk about like roster split and stuff and how you're going to use different wrestlers, but it stands a chance to get a lot of wrestlers over that really have struggled in this, what's increasingly felt like a bloated and overloaded roster. It doesn't have to feel like that. Despite how many wrestlers Tony Khan signs, it doesn't have to feel like it is overloaded and bloated, but his way of booking them was part of the problem. Getting them for like 2 or 3 really hot weeks and then not seeing them again because they were replaced by somebody else was what gave you the feeling of it being, there just being too many wrestlers. This could solve that problem whilst setting up all these brand new storylines. I'm an advocate for keeping the rosters as separate as possible for that reason. Even if stories start to mirror each other with Wednesdays and Saturdays, I don't think it'll feel like that as much if the performers themselves are different.
One thing they're going to struggle with here before we move on, sorry to interject very quickly, is that AEW and Dynamite, their entire MO is the wrestling buffet. You get all of what you want if you're a big sort of wrestling fan and loves the range of the form. So you get like lucha, you get brawls, you've had grapple with Thatcher and Danielson, you've got like North American style death matches, Japanese style death matches, strong style, like everything. It's going to be hard, given how much they embrace the range of pro wrestling, for these shows to be distinct from one another, which worries me slightly.
Nobody's ever talked about the Rampage buffet, have they?
No.
As much as you get different things, and it does follow that model theoretically with Dynamite, it's never been really discussed in practice in the same way, has it?
We'll talk about potential matches, personnel in due course, but obviously they've taken major influence from Monday Nitro with the visuals for AEW Collision. In terms of the show, what's it going to look like?
I desperately hope it's fantasy booking to say, make it look like Nitro. People love the Nitro set, and the logo is obviously this loving homage to it, and TNT, I think, is a big driver of that. The fact it's on TNT and you can have that as part of the logo is quite nice. A set similar to it really wouldn't hurt. I sometimes wonder if, say, my own personal love of wrestling aesthetics is to do with a distance that I sometimes have, not so much from Dynamite, but from the pay-per-views in AEW, but it is a conversation you increasingly see more of because they set the standard really high early doors. It's Jon Moxley throwing Kenny Omega off the stack of chips. It's as weird as it was because Full Gear started off being about attire and then ended up being about cogs. The cogs still look cool. Like, you know, if you think about the good and bad of the Arthur Ashe shows, how amazing the stage looked the first time versus the arena and like what you could have done with it in terms of lighting it up. They've lately had a bit of a mixed record with their aesthetics, and like Andy Murray of this parish often says, the screens remind him too much of how WWE present television, and you don't want to tune in to as somebody that even likes WWE. I don't necessarily want to turn it into AEW.
You bloody love WWE?
Bloody love it, I do. And yet I don't want it to necessarily look like that.
Yeah.
I want it to be its own thing, and this is For me, a bit of an open goal. They might not say it that way. It's boring. It's capitalist to just say, "Hoy, big screens in a truck." I wish it wasn't, but it is. But I genuinely think they will earn, if we're talking about how to generate some good faith and good trust in this new show and the reason to tune in, you are really setting your soul out, I think, if it looks and feels new and different. Like, it can never be brand spanking new like Dynamite was, because that was an entire new company, new initials, everything. But the way AEW's looked over the last year just has contributed, I think, to that feeling that it's actually older than 4 years. It's helps it be missable sometimes. There was lots of discourse about the black ropes coming back. So I think people are seeing aesthetics and wanting them a certain way. And I do think this is a huge opportunity for AEW to just dress the show slightly differently as a way to create further divide between the two nights.
I've got a slightly different take in that I loved at the start the entrance tunnels, like the sort of the hot spotlights that weren't LED, and just the fact that it was really brightly lit in a normal light compared to like those deep primary hues of blue and red on Raw and SmackDown, because it looked like Nitro without the same set, but it looked aesthetically like bright, like Nitro used to do. And then I thought when they needed to take the next step, I was all in favor of something more futuristic, not sub WWE, but a little bit more futuristic, a little bit more big time. I don't want it to look like Nitro necessarily, even though I loved Nitro and it looks great, because I just think it's nostalgia porn. And as much as I like that, I can go and watch Nitro. I don't necessarily think it's this really cool new look that's striking to a new audience. Like, we're all in our late 30s. Of course, we and many other people on Twitter want it to look like Nitro. Will a younger audience that AEW was trying to go for think that looks good, or just will they think it looks like chintzy, janky? What I would do, and it's not particularly TV friendly, I guess, rip off Backlash. It looked amazing. Don't have a massive set at all. Have it look like this really minimalist, understated, warts and all. This is just a pro wrestling arena where pro wrestling fights happen. And that could maybe mirror the vibe of my idea for how the storyline structuring and plotting should go, where intense focus on just make it look like Crockett. That's the nostalgia you should be looking for.
When Sid said Backlash there, I thought you meant the pincers, because they'd be colliding.
No, I'm just obsessed with Bad Bunny's entrance.
Well, you see, what would be better than one SmackDown fist? Two SmackDown fists.
Colliding.
Collision. Two SmackDown fists.
You know what you're doing?
Double SmackDown.
And I think you're an absolute knob.
Double SmackDown goaded.
I'm going to make
really annoyed me.
Well, I'm only going to make things worse.
I hate the SmackDown fist.
Because we have to talk about a roster split. In terms of personnel on this show, we sort of know a few people obviously associated with it. Who'd you like to see on it? Who'd you like to see on the debut episode? Potential even matches and main event. But also your general thoughts on a brand split almost within AEW.
I'm not, like, I don't like it. I don't like it. It feels like a compromise. What I love about AEW's general approach, and I'm not saying this necessarily changes, but I love when, just before the main event, Excalibur tells you what's happening next week. Because even now, it's still like a boundless possibilities factory of, he's wrestling him. What, next week? That's amazing. You know it's possible because these wrestlers are either hired to full-time deals or are Tony Khan has access to them and can use them every now and then per his working agreements with New Japan or whatever. And that, if there's collision and there's a separate roster, like, you're really narrowing the scope. Now, he was able to do this with a much, much leaner roster before it blew up to incredibly ridiculous proportions in 2022. But I just don't like the idea that you're kind of narrowing that down. And I don't like the idea of what inevitably happens. In every wrestling booker always makes the same mistakes, and it makes me despair over the state of the industry. There's always too many titles get introduced. There's always too many gimmick matches that stop making sense and they don't have the same prestige. And the excess has defined my sort of, I don't think it's a love-hate thing with AEW, but I'm certainly removed from it compared to where I was about 1 or 2 years ago. And I just think that, right, you've got 2 rosters now. And, all right, okay, well, the world champion, there isn't a big title program on one show. And maybe that's why we're suffering. Should we get a second title? Now, that seems like something Tony Khan wouldn't do, particularly given the way that certain cynical WWE observers reacted to the new World Heavyweight title. I'm not saying that WWE fans hate this development, but you'd think, all right, okay, that's not the mistake I would make. But Tony Khan did things that he said he wasn't planning on doing in 2019 because that's how these things shake out. So, yeah, I just don't like the idea of the split. Personally, I think it will better allow Tony Khan to indulge things that he's already prone to indulging himself with, like the same mistakes that every other booker makes. Like too many factions, too much blood. Like remember Double or Nothing 2019? Watching Dustin Rhodes, I thought he was going to die. Yeah. And when he didn't, it was great. And it was so powerful. Yeah. That's gone. Like so much is gone from AEW with this excess. Like the shock debut. Like Jeff Cobb got a bigger pop and more awestruck reaction than like bigger stars than Jeff Cobb after the fact, because that's what happens when you repeat things. And I just think that he will indulge the worst habits by having 2 rosters, so I'm not a big fan. And again, we are sitting here under the premise of let's go and fantasy book the best AEW Collision card. Maybe we're just terrible fantasy bookers, who knows? But it's hard for me to sit down and go, right, okay, what would be great for Collision? And what roster and what combinations of that roster would be great for Collision? Because, like, you kind of see all of this on Dynamite. There's nothing new in AEW. You know what I mean? It's a bad time to do this, I think.
What do you think about a roster split and a potential second world title in AEW?
I don't love a second world title, but if we are fantasy booking, I think the fantasy version of a roster split can work really well. It's not... Roster splits aren't popular because, like so much in North American wrestling, WWE have ruined it. There are good ways to do things that WWE have just failed to illustrate over and over and over again. But I think there is scant objective evidence that a roster split can be really, really effective, done very well, and make things more meaningful as a result. And I would use WrestleMania 21 as the objective evidence for that. A monster drawing WrestleMania that had 2 world title matches that were both like anointed.
Pretty rubbish.
Rubbish matches, anointed
but really effective.
Anointed 2 new stars at the same
Taking
time. You absolutely could have argued either one of those 2 storylines closing the show. Like, thank goodness it was Batista rather than that dreadful John Cena JBL match. But either way, the point was they were both going to be the next big things at the same time. Meanwhile, on the undercard, Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels was a legit dream match, and it was Raw versus SmackDown. So it was a WWE. If you've just started watching wrestling the last 2 or 3 years, it's a dream match because the best guy on Raw is fighting the best guy on SmackDown. I can't believe it. If you're a lifer like...
disciplined then as well.
Yeah, if you're a lifer like us, Shawn and Kurt, are you kidding? It was so disciplined by that point. And again, there are imperfections here because disciplined meant, I don't know, No Mercy 2004 being a SmackDown exclusive show, and it's like, who's going to want to watch that? But like
Great American Bash 2004.
Yeah, countless
Jesus
pay-per-views that, like, thank goodness over in the UK you still weren't required to pay for them all every month. I don't know who would. So again, it's tricky to manage, but I think it needs to be handled with discipline, but it also encourages discipline because you do have that leaner roster and you do think, right, these are the pieces on the board. Just exactly how much can I rearrange these? And let's say, well, we'll use this summer as a perfect example. Let's say they do that and then they stick to it for several months, but then the rosters come together for something like All In and they start teasing the prospect of maybe not something impromptu, but certainly one wrestler from Collision. So like it's going to be Wembley Stadium and I want you. And they've been kept separate for months, and it's Wembley Stadium where they're going to come together, and it's going to feel like a big show. I honestly think it could spice up the pay-per-views. I think it could like add a bit of extra.
You don't need spice. They're great.
Well, the Revolution and Double or Nothing builds this year have been like less than ideal, I would say. They do deliver on the night, pay-per-views by and large, but the builds haven't been quite as up to like the standard we've come to expect from AEW. And I think it would, again, if we're fantasy booking, this is well handled and it's carefully plotted, just like those WWE shows were, where you're like, well, you only bring wrestlers together on the Rumble and then, or the Survivor Series, and then the next time they see each other is the Rumble, and then you can use them if you want at WrestleMania. I can't believe that WWE was disciplined back then to do that, because then you've seen what's happened in the years hence. Vince McMahon would just get bored. It's like, I just want to see that match. Yeah, but Vince, we can't really have them interact for 6 more months. Do it tomorrow. Oh, well, that's dead then. Like, you want to believe that AEW is better and will handle with care, but I understand people's reservations about it.
Finally, then, debut episode of AEW Collision. Who do you want to be on it in terms of, do you establish a potential Samoa Joe CM Punk feud? Do you establish Chris Jericho, Andrade, Thunder, people like that?
Yeah. Like, not to be a downer, but you're limited in terms of your fantasy booking here, which is what AEW for me is not about. It's a possibilities factory where you can have this wrestler, no matter his background or her background or their background, and they can have this incredibly stylistically wild match with such and such. That's what AEW was, the buffet. It's kind of hard for me, and I'm sorry, I'm stepping on the dick of this podcast, which is meant to be more fun. And I'm sure I'll love Collision, at least for a while when it first begins. But the whole idea of this being a total compromise in the show that exists to pacify CM Punk and have him work with people who he hasn't butted heads with, yet, really limits the scope of fantasy booking, because you have to go through the drudgery of reality and play a game of, what's the game called? Process of elimination, right? Where it's, right, okay, well, you can't have him because CM Punk and that person had a backstage fight, or they had a run-in WWE and they don't see eye to eye, and he shot a shoot video where he buried CM Punk in a diner, and right, okay. That leaves CM Punk versus about 8 people who want to work with him. You know what I mean? It just... This is a mistake. Every time I talk around it and then try and delve into it, you can't fantasy book the drudgery and reality of pacifying CM Punk. It just makes it quite difficult. CM Punk versus Samoa Joe would be great, okay? They've got incredible chemistry, incredible history. They would, have this incredible match where CM Punk gets killed by CM Joe in the ROH trilogy at various points. It's amazing. This version of CM Punk selling much more than he did for Samoa Joe would be like an exceptional bit of work. But then, right, they get that done, and they maybe do a Chris Jericho program, and then the first blow's probably already happened. You know what I mean? Be more optimistic.
Well,
to send us home.
One of the guys that's been missing and missed has been Miro.
Yes.
And I think one of the reasons why people missed him so much is because we were just on the cusp of seeing him become a top guy. And it wasn't just an AEW... The character was an AEW creation in collaboration with Miro, but it was a feeling that we all had from the Rusev Day era when Vince McMahon just thought that was funny. And everybody was like, there's a yes movement on the cards here, and you're going to blow that. And he goes into AEW, and the character is different, but the feeling isn't. The vibe is the same, and he's rising up, and finally it's happening. Finally he's going to fulfill his potential, and then it doesn't happen for various reasons. One of them, obviously, being Miro's own, as we've later found out, reservations about certain matches, but also because the company was filling up and filling up and filling up. That might not be a problem. So you have that with a Miro. You extend that out to an Andrade. Thunder Rosa, and I'm using these examples on purpose because we've seen them advertised for it, but because in storyline, for storyline purposes, Thunder Rosa and Miro are apparently the reason why Tony Khan devised... if you two come around, I best do Collision. If you remember, those two
45-minute, multi-million TV deal.
We'll give you a show. But Thunder Rosa, as somebody that for a while we were all very excited to see lead up a women's division and didn't for various reasons, but still could and might get the chance to now. I say fantasy booking because there's so many ifs and buts. I share Sidgwick's worries about this because we've seen loads of versions of this go wrong. We've seen the WWE brand split era go wrong. We've seen Thunder be kind of the beginning of the end for WCW as a company. This won't do that for AEW. But in terms of how much you can really be invested, there are loads of ways in which this goes wrong. But in fantasy booking, a bunch of talent that I wish it wasn't because they're friends with CM Punk and they're friends with the Elite. And I'd like to think over time, those won't be the dividing lines. Hopefully, people can work together, people can make friends. Who's a good example of somebody that could work? Darby Allin, you assume, could play both sides. Had this great run with CM Punk, but has obviously, at this point, been colleagues with the Elite for years and is so key to AEW's success. MJF may be another, right? Huge,
well, I was just about to say
stars,
him,
right?
Because that establishes it, because the whole thing was MJF doesn't go on Rampage.
He'll lose the belt, but he'll value Collision as just important. Those are two guys that are massive stars. They might start on Dynamite and Collision, respectively, if there was to be a hard split. But they're people that can switch. And these roster splits don't have to last forever. I'm not suggesting we have an AEW superstar shake-up, but there can be Changes made. Eddie, like
I am suggesting we have a WhatCulture AEW draft.
Do you know, there's precedence to this already. Eddie Kingston is sick of working for Tony Khan. He's going to Ring of Bloody Honor. Like, so they've done it in their own stories already. So
it wasn't good.
It wasn't good, but you can do better versions of this. I think it's because he was going to Ring of Honor. If this was already in play and he was like, I don't want to work Dynamite anymore, but I'll go to Collision, we'd be like, awesome, we're getting Punk Kingston too. Like there would be examples of how it can work. But, and there is loads of buts and howevers with Collision, if we're fantasy booking anything AEW, the biggest match, bar none, is CM Punk versus Kenny Omega. And that's one of the few ones that simply cannot happen right now unless we reach the point where we are doing Stadium Dream matches. Yeah. And that's why there's so many caveats and qualifiers.
I'll say one more thing that's probably more true to the title of the podcast, just in time for everyone to have tuned out, is that the thing I hate about all of this at its core is that the fun thing about CM Punk returning after Brawl Out is, cool, obviously he's going to work the Elite. And he's going to work the other people that he fell out with. Great, let's make some money and have some really nice sort of stories with an edge. That isn't happening. Collision is happening in its place, and it could be a great compromise, but it's a compromise. If they can't do CM Punk versus the Elite, which sucks because it would be so awesome, do CM Punk versus MJF. MJF has got the perfect in-character motivation for not going on Collision, even though he's the champion. You could probably believe that he's not going to turn up because he never wrestles on TV hardly. That's his gimmick. He's a special attraction. Punk beats Joe. Lights go out. MJF versus CM Punk in the middle of the ring. And he kicks him in the balls again. And then shakes his hand over CM Punk's prone body and then walks out. Spits on him. I don't know.
And Punk's got a history for being annoyed on big shows, people stealing his spotlight.
Yeah, exactly. That would feed in. Wilburn, what a fantastic idea that is.
Butter, baby. I'm on a roll.
It's the one thing, because if you remember, CM Punk said, I have to work with pricks constantly, and that was in reference to MJF. It's one of the few things they can do that makes actual money from the CM Punk as an egomaniac, and he hates everyone, and everyone hates him. That's the intrigue here. And I think the closest they can get politically is CM Punk versus MJF.
Love that. Well, let us know your thoughts, your predictions, your fantasy booking for the debut of AEW Collision in the comment section below, or on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. Watch, they can follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
You can follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
Follow me at Adam Wilborn. Follow us all at WhatCultureWWE, and make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling wherever you get your podcasts from for daily wrestling podcasts. But for now, my thanks to the Dudley Boys. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon.